this video, we're going to be doing gestures for males this time, and it's going to be the same process with the female, but instead there's going to be some changes with the body. The process is the same. The only thing is that the shape language will be a bit different. So I'm going to be starting with the easier one, which will be in the one in the center because it's more in the frontal view. Now it's a bit hard to find poses that are more dynamic for men, while also not being too, static. So I chose standing ones first, and then we will do dynamic ones later on. So without further ado, let's start with the first pose. We're going to start with his cranium again. So always draw the cranium. And this guy has a bit of a 3/4 view of his head. And it's not exactly a side view like this, but more kind of like a more kind of like a 3/4 view where you can still see his jawline. So curve downward, and then bring it back up. You can see the jawline kind of has this, as I said earlier, sorry this is very blurry, but all we're looking at is the form. So I have the cranium and the jawline. It goes upward, and it doesn't pass the cranium. So some people have like a misconception of where the jawline is, and they think it's like up here, but it's actually curved upward, and it has a bit of a circle or room at the back to hold the neck, where the neck is in place. So keeping that in mind, let's do that. But first we have to do the cross line. So you have the center line in the middle. Remember, this is a 3/4. And his eyes are looking up here, so his eye line will be facing upward. So now let's go with the line of action. So we start with the neck, and this is a slight kind of S shape. You can kind of see it when you follow the path of his torso. It's leaning inward, and then his hips jut outward. So that's what the S line is. His weighted leg is on his right, and make sure that is straight, or very close to being straight. Just have a representation of weight. So now we have our S line figured out. Then we can separate this into simple shapes, which we have the rib cage as usual. And it's also important to know that where the rib cage is facing. So if you see your model and the rib cage is facing a certain way, you also want to make sure that for this model, his rib cage is kind of facing forward towards us. It's not exactly on the side like this, or not on the side here, but it's in the middle. So keep that in mind. And then we can draw the rib cage. And now, shortly after, let's work on the pelvis. Now the pelvis has a tilt to it. You can kind of start seeing a bit of upward from up here. So you can finally start having a pelvis that faces upward, like this. So it's always good to draw on top of your model to study it on which direction your pelvis is going. So map that out. Make sure that the distance isn't too far here or too close. You want to just right. A lot of these things is just about eyeballing, so it's not always accurate. Many people also have different kinds of forms, which we will talk about later. Head heights. And we'll be using a special character for that in that lecture. So now we have the box facing upward. You can see the bottom, you can see the top, but you can't see the top part of you can see the bottom, but and then you can see a bit of the side or the front side, but you can't see the top part of the box. So yeah. And now let's map out where the legs go. Now the legs can be a bit slightly longer. This guy has a bent leg that's kind of loose, and then his feet don't rest on completely on the floor, but the first one does because it's the weighted foot. So you can already see that which leg he's standing on versus which leg he's not standing on, and that's very important. Now let's map out the arms. And these can be just like sticks or some kind of line. So now let's fill it in. Now when it comes to men, you want to make sure that it's also broad but also simple shapes as well. So make the simple shapes thicker than the woman's. So we have a cylinder that's more broad. And in this case, we can connect the shoulders a little bit just to show that kind of difference. And then connect the rib cage with the pelvis while maintaining that triangular shape from his chest. And when it comes to men, their hips are a lot smaller than women's, because with women they have birth-giving hips, or their hips have to get bigger because biologically, they obviously give birth, so they need those hips for more fat and also more cushion and more of an opening to give birth. But men, they don't really need it. They have thinner hips. So yeah, so now let's block it in. We have our quad. So you can see I'm also imitating the form of the pose here of this leg. You can kind of notice that it's kind of cylindrical, and it's also thicker on the front. It gets thinner as it goes down to the kneecap, so be aware of that. That's how you draw the first pose. Now let's go with the second hardest pose, which is the one on the left, because it has a bit of a twist to it. And it's a bit more challenging because it's 3/4. So let's get started with the head again. Make sure you draw the cranium first. I'm always saying this just to remind you guys to think in forms rather than just try to draw a shape like this. It's not going to be worth it. A man's jawline is definitely a lot sharper. And then draw the S line. Now the S line, if you observe, also curves in, and then the hips kind of jut out. So it's a subtle one for this one, but other than that, it works. And every pose, you want to find that S line so you know where you're looking for. So you can see that hind leg is the weighted leg. Kind of goes crossed like this. So now let's put in the rib cage. Make sure it's not too big or it's not too small, just right. Everything always has to have a balance. And his rib cage is sort of tricky because it's facing a different direction, so it's kind of tilted and is more of like a 3/4 rib cage. and that's to show the kind of angle and direction of where the body is going. Same thing with the pelvis. It's also this one's tilted upward this time, because if you see the line of his pants, you can also see that it's facing upward by looking down below and seeing that there's some, depth and plane change to it. So his is also, if you guys look at the little dimples, it's also showing that it's facing upward. So just a little bit of ways, draw the box. Make sure your lines are almost parallel when you draw the box, because it's also very important to make sure it's in the same direction of where your vanishing point is. So now it's blocking the legs. Front leg goes in front, and it's sort of bent and a tiptoe shape. Maybe a bit longer because this looks a bit stocky. And this crosses over, which is the weighted leg, and that is flat on the ground. And you want to emphasize that. And now you can add his arms, making sure that the elbows are around the end of the rib cage. Same for the other one. Now we can fill it in a little bit. By connecting all the shapes. Making sure that you can even go over the lines where the shoulder is and everything, because we'll be covering all the muscle groups and all that stuff later on. But notice where it twists. And notice where the hip goes. Make sure you add some thickness to the legs. As well as the other. So this guy's leg is in front, I think. No, actually it's at the back. Never mind. This one's facing straight. So that is the second gesture. And now let's go with the third one, which has the most movement, and it's a bit tricky because his arms are up, and there's also a lot of stretch going on. You want to make sure that you find models that are straight looking and also not too difficult, especially when you're going to map out the muscles later. I'm not going to be, for the later videos on muscle groups and also simple shapes in the next couple lectures in this section, I'm going to be using the simpler poses, so I can, tell you guys which muscle goes which, as well as dividing this into simple shapes, even more like into perspective. So be aware of that. This is more of a fun exercise for this pose, the hardest ones. So I don't really expect you to completely draw this perfect. So let's draw the cranium. I already divided the face into two, because he's looking kind of upward. His face is sort of moving upward as well, because you can see the bottom of his jaw and the bottom of his chin. And now his pose has a bit of an S shape as well, but it's very subtle. His weighted leg is on his right again. And you want to keep that in mind as you draw. So his weighted leg is on this side. Maybe even draw a little bit of the second one if you want to. So now let's go with the rib cage. And I can already see the rib cage on this man. It's very straight, but it's facing upward. You can see the muscular side of his torso, and that's what makes it look big, so don't be fooled. This rib cage is a lot smaller than you think because the muscles are overlapping over the rib cage, so it's a lot smaller. That's why when you see it like a small rib cage like this, rather than when it should be like this, you know, in theory, it's not, because it's just bone for the plain rib cage. It's facing straight. You can add the pelvis, which is more of a downward shape, because you don't really see anything below. Especially when his rib cage is facing upward, it's best to have a pelvis that faces downward. And that's another part of looking at figures. It's kind of like opposites attract, where one rib cage faces up and then the pelvis faces down. So it gives that nice, like, kind of elongated torso or stretch. Or it could be facing downward and facing upward, the box. So it gives a nice crease and foreshortening, as I said earlier with the pillowcase. So this guy has a more of a stretched look, and I want to emphasize that with the pelvis that faces downward. And then his leg is already mapped out for this weighted leg, and you can see the bentness of the other leg covering behind the other. And now we can map out his arms. That one's facing up, so I'm going to just make this smaller so it's easy to see everything. See him grabbing the other arm, and then his hand outstretching. And now we can fill this in by making his neck very broad and showing just a hint of his shoulders. And connecting the ribcage to his pelvis. And making his legs longer if needed be, because this is a bit too short. Just roughly draw in the other leg. And that is how you draw gestures for men. So let me just organize this once more. Erase all these. Like I said earlier, I will make a little sheet of all little tips when drawing these gestures, like such as the pelvis and the rib cage, so it'll be more clear to everyone drawing these. So yeah, that's that. I hope that this was helpful in defining the male figure and helping you guys know how to block all these gestures in simple shapes and then drawing them over. So yeah, anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this. Let me know if you guys have any questions or any help or feedback that you need to improve your artwork. So anyways, I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Bye-bye.